Hello, I am Bartomeu Mari, Director of the National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art, and today we're going to visit the exhibition of Akram Zaatari, Against Photography, an annotated history of the Arab Image Foundation. This is an exhibition about the history of photography and the images of the Arab world. The Arab world is extensive, but it used to occupy mainly the Middle East and North Africa, and through the 20th century the diaspora has spread the Arab world throughout the world. Akram Zaatari is an artist from Lebanon, and in Beirut is where the capital of Lebanon is where the Arab Image Foundation was found in the 1990s by a group of artists that after the civil war decided to focus on photography as heritage, but in a non-traditional, non-institutional way. So we're going to visit an exhibition that talks about the Arab world and talks also about the conditions of photography as we used to know it. Photography is a technical invention, a means of capturing reality, the images of reality, and a means of reproduction that many specialists believe caused the origin of the modern art. That means that a technical invention, which, as we will see at the end of the exhibition, coincides chronologically with the invention of the car, with the motor vehicle, has had very intense life throughout, from the late 19th century until very recently, when the digital means of reproduction have more or less finished with more than a century-long history of making and reproducing images. This exhibition is about photography, the photography that used to exist, and it is about the Arab world. But we're going to start by looking at the timeline of the exhibition that tells us the material history of the collections of the Arab Image Foundation. The collections of the Arab Image Foundation are composed of photographs that were brought together. Today we would say that were curated by artists through making exhibitions, and we have in vertical the titles and of the exhibitions that were organized and the places where the exhibitions took place, as well as the publications that were done with in relation to those exhibitions. And we see that we begin in 1987 when also we see in the wall the representation of the amount of photographs that were incorporated into the collections of the foundation through time. In the horizontal line we have time, and we see the amount of photographs that were brought into the collections of the foundation through the exhibitions organized always by artists. This is important because the foundation is not like any other institution or any other archive. It is made and it accumulated photography through the eyes of artists. We could say that the Arab Image Foundation is an artist project that takes the form of an archive. And we will see also that the leading role of Akram Zaatari in this process has been very significant in making that institution to be in itself an artwork, not only a place where photography, where heritage, where history is preserved. We will see later on that the photography that is conserved and preserved in the foundation is not only images, it is also objects, but above all, photography is about histories. It's about telling stories not only contained in the image of the photography, but contained as an object and the stories that surround that image. In that way, the Arab Image Foundation is a pioneering institution in analyzing or in treating photography beyond imagery, beyond its iconographic power. We see in the timeline the representation of what seems to be a map, and in fact those are the places in the world where the collections of the Arab Image Foundation come from. We've seen Mexico, where an important community of Arab people is located. We see the territory that is shared by, or that connects Palestine with Lebanon and with Syria. Palestine is the historical name of a place of great conflict, as everybody knows, between the state of Israel and Palestine in itself. Iran is also the place where a very important archive was brought into the foundation and later on was taken away. Again, big accumulation of photographs. I believe that this is the incorporation of the archives of Hashem El-Madani, a photographer, studio photographer from Zaida, the same city where the artist Akram Zaatari was born and grew up. We will find Hashem El-Madani later on in the exhibition, and bringing into the foundation the archives and the photographs of this studio supposed quantitative jump in the constitution of the collections. Again, the traces of the collection of the photographer from Iraq, I believe his name was El Shaderji. Originally the photographs were put on loan in the foundation. They were not given, and later on the American University of El Cairo agreed to conserve them in property, so they left the foundation. This is important because the trace of what used to be part of the collection of heritage is as important as the heritage in itself. We will see later on that presence and absence is a very important element to read or to navigate through the exhibition, as the presence of the object and the absence of images is going to be a very important subject in the exhibition itself. We're going to advance in time in order to enter the exhibition in itself, but I propose to stop for a little while into this book, which is the catalog, the complete catalog of the collections of the Arab Image Foundation. Every single collection is listed here. This book only exists in one copy. It's the actual copy, the only place where we can go through the information in printed form. Of course, the foundation has a very well organized website where all visitors, all interested people can navigate all of these, but we also have to think that the printed form and the book used to be the way in which photographs existed in our culture. We're going to see photographs later on in many different forms, and the book used to be one of them. This exhibition is about the way in which photography has changed. And again, the representation here of the different boxes that contain the entire collection in the way they are deposited in the archives of the Arab Image Foundation is also, it's now an abstract image, but it is a way to describe photography as volume. Again, not as an image, but as an object, as volume, as space. We are in the first gallery of the exhibition, where we are surrounded by a number of light boxes. The light box is a language in which photography expressed itself in the publicity and advertisement, and in this case it is used to introduce some very important ideas about the history of photography that is being told in this exhibition. In the different light boxes, we see groups of images taken from certain archives of the Arab Image Foundation, from negatives. The negative is the master copy of photography from which endless number of reproductions can be made on paper. And throughout the 20th century and on the material of the negatives evolved quite a lot. We do have examples of negatives that were based on glass. And in this case, we have images printed from negatives that were stuck together, and the two negatives became glued, so they could not be separated, and what comes out of it is actually like a photo montage produced by history, by time, but produced also by chance. There is no reason, logical reason that explains why the two images came together. In this case, we see the work of a studio photographer from Tripoli from the 40s, and we can see as well images, portraits of French soldiers that were occupying the territory at that time, superimposed with images of local people. The Arab world, the modern history of the Arab world is a history of colonization throughout the 19th and 20th century until after the Second World War. Most of the Arab world had been the area of colonization by the European powers. Mainly France, in this case, could be Britain in most of the Middle East, or Germany. The history of photography tells also the history of that colonization and the history of independence, as we will see later on. In this other case, we can see also the messages that were printed on the negative itself when it became a film. And there were several different generations of chemical materials and procedures. These different images tell us a moment in the history of photography that in which not only the technique but also the messages printed, the warnings, and the messages printed on the film itself were evolving. And we have also the beginning of the color film. Photography started as a black and white production of images, but when color photography appears, photographers were not yet used to the fidelity of the reproduction. So as we will see in the case of these images, hand coloring was quite usual. This is, in fact, these images show the deterioration of the negatives of color photography in the first generation as they appeared. And deterioration, the losing of the image, is also the theme of the images represented there, where we see that the negative, when affected by climate conditions, either temperature or humidity, may lose completely the information it contained, and it becomes an abstract image that no longer represents what the reality used to be. The exhibition also includes several films. We can hear behind myself the voice of Van Leo, a studio photographer from Cairo, that Akram Zaatari made the subject of several works. In this case, a film where an interview with the artist recalls the practice of a studio photographer from the first half of the 20th century until the late 20th century. Van Leo is an artistic name, but he was a creative studio photographer, where he innovated enormously in the styles of portraiting his clients. Other films in the exhibition include the next room, where two films analyze practically synthesize the entire relationship of Akram Zaatari with the Arab Image Foundation. The films are part 1 and 2 of a work titled On Photography, People and Modern Times. And in part 1, the artist focuses on the collections of the Arab Image Foundation and the preservation techniques that are supposed to keep photography and transmit it through time. This is an interesting problem because we come from a room where we look at how photography deteriorates, how negatives lose their quality, and how reality disappears behind the abstraction of images. So, in principle, institutions like museums, archives, libraries, and so on, tend to preserve at all costs the objects. In Akram Zaatari's interest is to go beyond the idea of preservation and focus as well on photography as an object. We will see that theme later on, but as I mentioned, this is the focus on the first part of On Photography, People in Modern Times. On the second part of the film with the same title, we can see people talking about photographs that were lost. It's people who lost their photographs in the case of wars. The Middle East and the Arab world have been the stage of many wars, even some very recent and some still ongoing, as we all know, unfortunately. So by interviewing people who lost their photographs because of war and talking about them through digital reproductions in iPhone, in telephones, or in iPads, or in computers, Zaatari makes the exact negative image of the first film, that is about preserving photography, and in the second film he focuses on photography lost. In the in this room, Akram Zaatari synthesizes the work and the fascination with Hashem El-Madani, a studio photographer from his native town, Saida in Lebanon. And we see at the back several images of the studio of Hashem El-Madani as it was when Zaatari did this work. In the different boxes are objects and photographs from that studio. And from the archives and collections of Hashem El-Madani, many different projects of the Arab Image Foundation and many different works of the artist Akram Zaatari evolved. I like to mention here that Zaatari was did not study photography. He studied cultural studies and cinema in Lebanon and in the United States, and belongs to a generation that became active in the 1980s with a very renewed interest in photography as a cultural production, not only as a means of capturing reality and of reproducing reality, but as a cultural phenomenon. The entire exhibition and the work of the work of Akram Zaatari precisely could be synthesized in the idea of working with photography beyond images. This is why the title of the exhibition, Against Photography, takes many different senses. It's not against as an opposition, it is also against as we lean against a wall in order to sustain ourselves. So it is also about promoting photography, but beyond the conventional approach of either museums or historians. We have seen in the first room the way in which photography in its traditional means deteriorates and disappears. In this case, deterioration, alteration, transformation, and disappearance is also the protagonist of the different works in this exhibition. We have here a very interesting historical case again caused by chance. We have the superimposition of photographs taken by both a Palestinian photographer from the early 20th century and a Zionist Jewish photographer that the conservation brought together and glued, again producing combined images in a metaphor of a very strong political sense. The confrontation of two communities in Palestine, Israel, has historical roots. It wasn't historically what it is right now, and metaphorically, this work also talks about two communities living together by need, not confronted. In the next work, again, the superimposition of negative produces a very important historical narrative, because these works belong to a studio photographer from Cairo, from the period of the independence of Egypt after the 1950s. Egypt declared independence from the colonizing power of Britain, and for a period of time it was under a commercial blockade that prevented any import. So the Egyptian population had to invent ways of producing the goods that could not be imported in the country. And in the next work we have a very important way to look again to photography beyond images. These are prints based on the 3D reproductions of photographs that look at photography as an object. The 3D printer doesn't record the image, it just records the surface. And these are four different ways to print 12 different sets of photographs. But of course, we are left with a complete abstract image, not the image represented in the photography, but the image of the object itself. And again, photography beyond images is the subject of the archives of El Chaderji. In fact, is an architect from Baghdad who gave his lent his archives to the Arab Image Foundation, but then later on were taken for conservation to the archives of the Arab University in Cairo. These are the files in which photographs arrived in the Arab Image Foundation, and these are the traces of the collections in the Arab Image Foundation when the photographs themselves were brought to Cairo. So the representation of objects that were images and they became the shadow of images in the files that used to keep them is again a way to talk about the disappearance of photography as it used to be. In fact, that theme becomes the leitmotif of the entire exhibition as we walk towards the end, and it reflects as well a very important metaphor. The digital world has exhausted the photography as we used to know it and has created a completely different type of photography that no longer depends on material, that is pure data. We walk towards the end of the exhibition, and paradoxically, the end of the exhibition is a representation of the way in which the Arab Image Foundation started. Out of the generation of trained in visual studies and cultural studies came the idea of reading photography, interpreting photography as an instrument of the representation of history. The first projects of the Arab Image Foundation were looking at the development or the association of photography and modernization in the Arab world. And these are works that synthesize very early projects of the foundation and of Akram Zaatari, where, for instance, he looks at the practice of studio photographers that represent the upper classes, and where you could find also the absence of the working class. The photograph represents who pays it, who commissions it. And also in these cases, photographs are represented not only through the image, but also giving an equal relevance to the back of the print. Photographs are both the image and what is at the back of the image are objects. In this case, these sections represent the association of modernity and the motor vehicle. Transport, cars, planes, boats are the subject matter of this first exhibitions and these first projects, as well as a very important type or genre that the artist identifies in numerous family album photographies. I have to say that we've seen by now that photography is not only the work of artists and of big professional names, but it is also the product of studio photographers. It is also the product of people we have not identified, anonymous people, and it is something that is private, that belongs to families, individuals, as well as it represents history. So the distance and the tension between the private meaning of a photograph and its public projection, its public meaning, is also something central in the work of the Arab Image Foundation. This series of photographs represent the shadow of the photographer. In many occasions, when we started taking photography ourselves, we would favor those images taken with the sun in our back, the lighting up the subject represented in the picture. In most cases, the shadow of the photographer appeared in the photograph, and the eye of the artist identified that as some kind of a genre in the numerous photographs conserved in the Arab Image Foundation. The shadow of the photographer is also a metaphor, probably, for its disappearance. We see the shadow of the photographer, we don't see the photographer. We know that it's been there, but we don't know who the photographer is. Again, photography is a word that originates from two different words in Greek. Photos, which means light, and graphos, which means writing. Photography is writing with light. In a way, photography is in itself a shadow. So the metaphorical circle is closed in this room where the history of photography is contained as it used to be. As I said, the digital world has produced that photography since the late 20th century is something radically different. And probably we still don't know what photography exactly is. The exhibition of Akram Zaatari Against Photography, an annotated history of the Arab Image Foundation, will remain open at MMCA Seoul until the 19th of August, and I'd like to invite everyone to take the trouble and the pleasure of visiting, enjoying, learning, listening, not only looking but also playing with art, with photography, with representation, with history, and with the work of a great artist that is Akram Zaatari. Thank you.
Everybody in the world have photographs. We have them on mobile phones, on tablets, on our computer. We keep them in our wallet. The grown-ups have albums. We used to have albums on which we put our pictures. The universal archive is the archive of all the pictures of everybody in the world. We all share something, a relationship to photography, and we feel this universal imagination with photographs. This is different than this. The moment I have light, the moment I allow a more visible scene to take place. And if the light is even more intense, I see more. Here, this is a negative that is blown a little bit beyond its original size to show the little defects in it, to show what happened to it over time. So taking one step back, you see a different perspective, becomes an archaeological artifact. All our cell phones will be, or the chips or the SIM cards will be archaeology one day, and we will only excavate through them to be able to see the pictures that are recorded on them. So archaeology for the future.